Welcome everyone to our Engineering Impact Series, Water and Indigenous Communities. I would like to begin by acknowledging that Dalhousie is located in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. I am pleased to be introducing our faculty's second speaker event and glad you could join us this morning. The Engineering Impact Series shines a light on the many ways engineers contribute to and improve our communities. Equally, it allows us to celebrate the contributions of women in engineering and Black, Indigenous, and people of color in engineering. I am pleased to welcome our student moderator, Tony Mullins, and 4 panelists, each of whom work within the water industry. Today, our panelists will be discussing how Indigenous communities are impacted by water infrastructure and accessibility issues. Our panelists explore some of the issues and discuss how engineers contribute to the necessary solutions. As a quick housekeeping item, in addition to our questions that are for our panelists, I encourage you to leave your own questions in the comment section. The questions will be answered in the audience Q&A portion of the event. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator. Tony is a Master of Applied Science student in the Center for Water Resource Studies. She is involved in several drinking water projects with a primary focus on microbial parameters present in the distribution systems and the application of UV LED disinfection. Tony, over to you.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see you all. So I have the pleasure of introducing you guys all to our 4 incredible panelists. So this conversation should be incredibly insightful. So first, what I would like to do is I'm going to have you each introduce yourselves, have a little chat about who you are, what you do, what your work is like. And I'll just call out your names and then you can speak on yourself. So Carl, since you're first on my screen, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Carl Yates. I'm the Interim Chief Executive Officer for the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority. I came into that position on June the 1st, 2020, after working closely with the Atlantic Policy Congress on the aspect of the formation of the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority. And in a previous life, I was the General Manager of Halifax Water. So recently retired from there in 2019, but had the privilege to come on board to help establish a going concern utility for First Nations by First Nations.
Tiani, would you like to go, please?
Hi, I'm Tiani Paul, and I'm from the First Nations community of Eskisoni. And I work with AFNWA as the operations engineer. And my job requires me to do water safety plans, as we call Nujodamek Sangwan. And I'm a recent graduate of the Dalhousie engineering program with an environmental engineering degree. And I started working with AFNWA in June.
Julie.
Hey, I'm Julie DeSico. I am an environmental engineer with Dillon Consulting. I did an environmental engineer bachelor's degree with Dalhousie, and I went on to pursue a master's of applied sciences through the Civil Water Resource Center, investigating disinfection byproducts in the distribution system. Primarily, my role at Dillon has been working with First Nation communities on water, wastewater, housing related issues and concerns.
And finally, Ryan.
Hi, everyone. My name's Ryan. I'm coming to you from the unsurrendered, unceded territory of the Wolastoqey Nation. I am a member of the Kingsclear First Nation and actually am sitting in Kingsclear First Nation right now. My background, I did my graduate work in hydrogeology, but I think maybe I might be the only UNB grad here, but apparently no ties to Dalhousie formally. But I previously worked for Dillon Consulting for 17 years, and for the last 10 years been primarily focused in Indigenous infrastructure, ranging from water, wastewater systems, and as well as new infrastructure in the form of economic development, among many other things. So the last 2 years, I started working on development of an Indigenous partnership with Dillon Consulting, which I am president of, that officially was announced in June of last year. So we're coming up on 1 year of operations of SOAR Professional Services Limited Partnership, which is I think a fairly innovative approach to providing Indigenous services, much the same as the AFNWA, breaking barriers and trying new things. Thanks.
Awesome. So it's pretty clear that we have a very varied group of panelists here today, and we all find ourselves in the engineering world fitting in a different way, and finding ourselves in the water industry in a different way. And since this panel was mainly distributed to engineering students, and I assume that we have quite a few engineering students or soon to be graduating engineering students in the audience today, I'd like to talk a little bit about how you decided that the water industry was something that you wanted to build your career in, or how did you find yourself working in water? Tiani, I'd really like to start with you, since you are a most recent graduate and you've kind of gone through this process really recently, so it's kind of fresh. So to you, I would ask how you decided to build your career in water.
So as an Indigenous woman that was raised in Eskizoni, you connect with water spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and physically. And all my life, I was passionate about water. And as going through university and high school, you see issues on water crisis in First Nations communities. And I wanted to help my people and different Indigenous communities around Canada to have better drinking water and wastewater services around.
Awesome. Julie, to you.
Sure. So after graduating from my bachelor's, I felt that I wanted to specialize in something, and I had a few options for what I would do a master's into, but I decided to go with the water sector because it's something that I've always connected with as well. I love being around water, in water, drinking water, and I knew it was something that was going to be useful to me, and because it's something that we all need to survive. So that was an easy choice for me.
Awesome. Ryan?
Apparently we're going in the order of graduating year.
Not intentionally.
So I originally went into my university program, and there's some misconceptions out there about Indigenous students, essentially being fully funded to attend university. It's not necessarily a true depiction of the situation. So actually, while I was going to university, I was not funded by my community, but rather by scholarships. So obviously I had to work pretty hard for those, but a number of those scholarships were Indigenous focused programs, though, like the formerly the Aboriginal, now called Inspire program. But to that end, I guess as I was going through my program and as I was working my way into my graduate degree, I wanted to give back. And because I was given the privilege to graduate university with relatively low debt. I thought one way I could perhaps support our communities was by going into the field of hydrogeology at the time, and really that was the main driving force. Even 17 years ago, as long as that may seem. 17 years ago, a lot of the issues that are still prominent in our communities today with respect to access to clean drinking water, it was well known even 17 years ago. And this was my attempt at helping to give back.
Great. And finally, Carl.
All right. Well, I guess, yeah, I think you went by age, Ryan, is what you did. So younger to older. So there you go. Well, I think, people should realize that I came to engineering fairly early in my life, but I should comment to say that I grew up on an island. Now, many of you might think I'm talking about the island of Newfoundland from my slight dialect and accent. But actually, I grew up in the town of Deer Lake. And for those who don't know, Deer Lake is an island. and it's surrounded by its namesake, the lake itself, the Humber River, Junction Brook, which flows from Main Dam, and that's a misnomer. Brooks in Newfoundland, you have to appreciate, are really rivers for everybody else. And also the man-made Humber Canal, which brought the water down from Grand Lake into the hydroelectric plant in Deer Lake. So totally surrounded by water. So everywhere I went, I made contact with water. But I also made a lot of contact with earthworks. I mentioned the Humber Canal, and my grandfather actually worked on that Humber Canal. So that's a bit of a family story as well. But basically, I went into engineering and actually ended up becoming a geotechnical engineer, which, when you talk about earthworks, shouldn't surprise anybody. So after 5 years of consulting, I saw an opportunity to really bridge between geotechnical engineering and water when I joined Halifax Water. So I liked the concept. I remember when I was being interviewed for the job, and I said, look, my specialty is below the ground. And with water and wastewater, unfortunately, most of our infrastructure is below the ground. And I think I can bring that expertise to good use. So that was my pitch, and I never looked back after that.
Great. Well, thank you all. I think that will be really interesting for anyone who's graduating soon and looking at what careers that they should be pursuing or what is available for them as options. It's always kind of intimidating. It's nice to have insight from people who have done it before you. So this panel has been titled Water and Indigenous Communities. So I think it would be kind of a miss if we didn't talk about boil water advisories. So as we all are probably familiar with, short-term boil water advisories are often implemented in Indigenous or First Nation communities. And they usually are implemented due to operational or maintenance concerns, and they don't necessarily reflect a direct public health concern. And from an engineering perspective specifically, what does a boil water advisory mean, and how could a boil water advisory or another approach be used to ensure safe water? So Ryan, maybe to you first.
Okay. So more often than not, you're right. The boil water advisories are put on due to more or less a lack of confidence in the system. So, frequently those short-term ones there was a break in the line depressurized, some contaminants may have been introduced into the distribution, and to that end, we have to wait the appropriate time for, a sample, follow-up sample, and then confirmation. But, I think from an Indigenous perspective, one of the things that's really, has to be highlighted is the reason why these breaks happen fairly regularly is because the infrastructure is aging, and typically Indigenous Services Canada tends to take the approach that is highly reactive. There's some proactive planning or funding that happens, but that's usually on the projects that are a little bit, bigger or more interesting from a marketing perspective. So brand new water systems, wastewater systems, they don't tend to do as much investment into upgrades to basic distribution. And a lot of this infrastructure, it went into place back when the communities were established, sometimes in the 40s, pre-war, post-war, and to that end, those very same lines, they remain in place. And so, honestly, this is a good plug for the work that AFNWA is doing right now. And I'll let Carl talk about it. But when you get into an asset management framework where you're actually starting to proactively come up with strategies and game plans to address that aging infrastructure, that's when you start to see probably a real reduction in these short-term boil water advisories.
Carl, I guess that gives you a really good segue to talk about your perspective.
Yeah, I can certainly, add to that and echo Ryan's main comment that, this is usually a symptom of a problem, a boil advisory, and is really, reactionary. So the flip side, of course, is to bring, longer term holistic approaches to be proactive. And they have a full suite of possibilities, from good capital planning, which includes, of course, an asset management plan, to good operational optimization as well. So we use both kind of themes to really, deliver what we would hope would be a more proactive approach. And water main breaks are a clear example where that is truly a reaction. So by putting in longer term plans like good asset renewal programs over time, you can change that from, in terms of performance, from many breaks to hopefully fewer breaks, but also to optimize your system in terms of hydraulics, as an operational program, so that you can minimize, pressure transients and those types of things to reduce incidents of breakage. So there's a lot of different programs you can bring to bear that can certainly flip things around in terms of level of service.
Yeah, for sure. Tiani, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
I agree with both of them, what they said, but also I find a boil water advisory is your due diligence as an engineer to put out an alert, and it's for the safety and well-being of the public and the First Nation communities. So yes, but that's what I would like to add.
And Julie?
Yeah, I was actually going to say something very similar to Tiani. So thanks for that. As engineers, we have the first and foremost duty to support and protect public health and safety. And so although the boil water advisory may not directly indicate a public health and safety concern, it's an indication of it, as Carl mentioned as well. So it's a due diligence point. Exactly.
All right, awesome. So we touched this a bit in this previous question, but often boil water advisories are a result of policy and procedure. So what roles do engineers play, and how can engineers affect change in policy and procedure to help provide access to clean and safe drinking water? So maybe Carl, you can go first. You have some experience in the policy world.
Yeah, certainly, good things always start with governance, and then from governance, often policies and procedures then follow. But in terms of engineers, we obviously have a role to solve problems. So often by putting in, better procedures, we can ensure there's a consistent approach. So if there is something that goes wrong, we can at least backtrack and figure out, what went wrong and then correct it. So that truly, I think, is a key feature of engineering is the application of science, and to document what we do, and then to review if there are issues to basically upgrade those policies or procedures. So hopefully, engineers bring the practical side to policies and procedures. So it's just not, should we say, an academic exercise, that these are things that are necessary to implement on the ground.
Julie, I'd like to go to you next as a consultant, like your perspective on policy and procedure.
So I took this question more so as an engineer's duty to, be lifelong learners and continue to fully implement new technologies, new procedures in place, and make sure that the industry is aware of those changes. So not only to directly affect policy and directly input on what, new policies, new procedures for best practices should be, but to continue to disseminate that knowledge to the industry and so forth that way.
I'd like to go to you, Tiani, next. As a new engineer, what your experience has been.
My experience has been really good so far, and right now I'm working with AFNWA. One of my jobs is to create a water safety plan for wastewater and drinking water, which we now call Nudodamek Sangwan, which is taking care of the water. But it's a risk assessment and risk management tool that we're using to address these issues, and using a scale from like 1 to 5 to check the risk, how high the risk is, low the risk is, and how we could mitigate these risks and be more proactive towards these risks. So that's one thing that you could do to ensure that these procedures and policies are being brought to the table.
And finally, Ryan.
Again, we all interpreted the question a little bit differently. My interpretation of it is based around, a lot of the policies and procedures that are in place that have, and regulations in general, many of them are quite dated. And to that end, due to a number of reasons, namely Indigenous underrepresentation within our industry. A lot of these regulations were developed in absence of our perspectives, and to that end, I think what you're seeing now is a modernization of some of those policies, procedures. AFNWA is a perfect example of that. This is truly an innovative approach to Indigenous water delivery in Indigenous communities by Indigenous persons, and it's something that seems somewhat obvious, but it didn't exist prior to now. So the reality is that due to that underrepresentation, we've gotten to a space where a lot of the regulations, policies, and procedures may not be representative of our concerns and our gaps and the limitations that exist within our community. So, to that end, I think this is one of the things that we all, as engineers, Indigenous or non-Indigenous or BIPOC, in general, we need to seek out solutions that are more inclusive, more diverse in thought, because it's truly the only way we're going to get a representative policy that will actually have the intended effect or consequence that we're looking for.
Yeah, I think that's something that we all need to think about in all parts of engineering, is inclusivity and how we're impacting those that we're designing for. So that being said, we've spoken a bit about kind of the non-tangible physical side of engineering. And I'd like to pivot a little bit and talk about engineering design specifically and physical changes that can better support communities. So in your opinion, what are the challenges that engineers face when designing water and wastewater solutions for Indigenous and First Nation communities? And how can these communities be better supported through engineering design? So maybe Julie first.
Sure. So one of the bigger concerns in First Nation communities is definitely a lack of people resources. So enough individuals that can work on these systems, because oftentimes, a water and wastewater operator typically has 2 or 3 other positions in the community that is of importance and requires their time. So I think in terms of engineering design, there are things that we can do to simplify operations to a certain extent. Of course, different, water qualities or different water sources will need to be treated to different standards depending on the water quality. And so we can't simplify the full system per se, but I think there's things that we can do to simplify operations and making sure that the design is completed in consideration of potential staff limitations in terms of time and resources. So 2 examples, actually, I have one on the wastewater side, and Ryan's familiar with this one since it was for a design that we completed in Kingsler First Nation, is something as simple as, spending a little bit more money to get a UV system that has self-cleaning bulbs on the system itself. And that helps, maintain operations to a certain extent. Of course, there's still some requirements there, but it's a small change that can go a long way to help preserve, the quality of the effluent leaving the system and operation needs in the wastewater system itself. Another thing is, while bidding for these projects or choosing the equipments, is to understand where are these serviced from, like where are the manufacturers, where are the suppliers, to make sure that the communities have support when these pieces of equipment need specialty assistance, right? So it's those types of questions that we should be asking to make sure that we are considering the current situation. And to build off what Ryan had said previously too, is to include them into the design and make sure that they understand this system that we're designing for, the treatment of their water source to public health standards is something that they are familiar with, aware of, and can fully manage themselves.
Incredible detail. Yeah, this is such a good conversation. Ryan, do you have anything to add to what Julia's talked about?
I'd probably just take a little bit of a deeper dive into that. Interestingly enough, the processes that are commonly utilized with respect to those major projects in First Nation communities is, it's very patriarch driven. Indigenous Services Canada issues an RFP. I'm not gonna, talk ill of that, but sometimes those RFPs are, somewhat generic, and not necessarily reflective of the actual community's needs. And again, that very same project that Julie was talking about, we had a great example there where we were actually doing a climate change and adaptation plan for the community. And in that climate change adaptation plan, which we also didn't follow the process that commonly engineers would use, we actually invited Indigenous elders, Indigenous land users, Indigenous youth into the planning exercise. And one of the things that we learned on that was the stream that wastewater plant was discharging to was commonly used for traditional practice, harvesting, collection of various traditional plants. And one of the things that was originally derived in that RFP was, well, the effluent will continue to go into it. And it's like, well, no, that doesn't really make sense for the community. And without that knowledge of the Indigenous land use, without that perception and perspective, we actually use that in having Indigenous Services Canada modify the RFP. So instead of it discharging into that local stream, we actually built a proper effluent and exited it into a much more appropriate place. So like that's one of those examples where having the perspectives of we're getting in two-eyed seeing, but this is truly one of those situations where you can actually modify the engineered approach in such a way that is much more meaningful and much more valuable to the community in both an engineering and a traditional perspective.
And sorry, just to build on that specific change did result in obviously schedule implications to redesign the outfall, and understanding that some timelines may be shifted because these are important things to consider for that. That's something else that I think as engineers we need to consider.
Ryan, if you want to hold your thought about two-eyed seeing, like we're going to get there just in a few seconds, really. Tiani, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Julie and Ryan actually hit it on spot on, but one thing I would say too is one major problem is probably the funding and responsibility of who is going to take responsible regulation-wise, because there's no true regulations on First Nation reserves. So that's two things that are spot on too with Ryan and Julie's discussion also.
Awesome. And Carl?
Yeah, good to see, design engineers take a deep dive on that because they live that every day. So, to add to it though, is, as an operator, pleased to hear that, very important to start with the end in mind. And that is, it's the operator, right? That's going to look after these things. So engage the operator in the design. This is so critical so they are understanding and get their feedback. And I think the engineer also has the obligation to not just walk away after the plan is commissioned, is to continue to go back and be part of the optimization of the plant, because everybody knows that plant usually takes anywhere from a year to 2 years before you actually get it really to the sweet spot that you want to have for operations. So I think that's also an obligation of the engineers to stay, connected with the first couple of years of operations to assist. And sometimes, to speak to funding, there's not funding for that. And that's often left out of the RFPs. It's just, build something shiny and then walk away, right? And that is not the right approach. So I want to emphasize, how important it is to stay connected. But the other thing to recognize as well, in a lot of First Nations communities, just as a direct statement, these are small systems. And as a result, small systems are sometimes the most challenging sometimes to design, so they can be simplified, right? There's, you might think, it's small and therefore you don't need a whole lot, but sometimes some serious technology goes into them. And that, is the challenge, right? To make sure it still treats the water or wastewater effluent properly, but also is something that is fairly decent to operate without too much intervention. The other thing that's really important here with small systems, to speak about engineering design, is the importance of having a very robust SCADA system, the supervisory control and data acquisition system, so that the person that's operating the plant, if they're off doing another job somewhere, can be connected to the plant either by mobile devices or the laptop, so they can always check in and see how the plant's going. So those designs do indeed need to have that robust SCADA system, just like any other system. Well, there's the final comments from me. Yeah.
Well, thank you all. Ryan, you touched a little bit on two-eyed seeing in your response to that question, and I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into the concept of two-eyed seeing. And for those of you in the audience that aren't familiar, two-eyed seeing is a term used when looking at solutions with one eye on traditional methods and one eye on modern engineering methods. So how can two-eyed seeing be incorporated into teaching the next generation of engineers? We are looking at an audience that is primarily engineering students, and I'd like your perspective on that, specifically Ryan first, if you don't mind.
All right. So to kind of back up a little bit, what we were doing, 10 years ago when we started doing major infrastructure in First Nation communities across Atlantic Canada and Canada, was I was building a team around me, and folks like Julie came on board. And what we were doing was, at the time, we didn't know we were doing two-eyed seeing. What we were doing was really looking for insight into the communities to better understand what we were designing, the solutions that we were designing. And to that end, what actually ended up happening was we built a team that's all they did. They just did Indigenous community infrastructure. And that's very different than the typical lens that you would see in the professional services industry. Normally, you'd see individuals that, might work on an Indigenous project. Most of the time, they're working on municipal projects or industry projects. And what happened was the team that we were building started gaining this perspective that was very different. Like, they understood the differences in community services. They understood the differences in Indigenous regulations. They understood all these very, very unique circumstances that are not typical of most of those municipal and industrial systems. Now, what was also building at the same time was a gain knowledge or perspective of Indigenous ways of life and knowing. And again, we didn't know it was two-eyed seeing at the time, but as we started getting into these other projects, like that climate change one that I talked about, this was a project that was actually driven by a PIVAC process, which is Engineers Canada, and they actually didn't want us to do necessarily the approach we were taking with that climate change project. But we thought it was too important to actually gain those perspectives of those land users. And in fact, we validated climate data through knowledge from Indigenous persons that said, well, this is where I used to collect this, and now I can't collect it there. And you could actually validate that based upon flooding or based upon changes in temperature, precipitation, and really it started to grab then. And we're like, okay, how do we take this further? And so that concept of two-eyed seeing becomes so imperative when you think about a project like that wastewater project, where we actually developed a much better solution for the community based upon the gained understanding of the Indigenous perspectives. And to that end, every project we've done since, much the same as most engineers would incorporate, climate change and the value system of how they're approaching their designs now. Well, we do the same with the two-eyed seeing perspective. We will not approach an engineering solution without having that deep understanding of Indigenous land use and traditional ways of life.
Yeah, incredible. Tiani, would you like to speak on two-eyed seeing as well?
Sure. I find two-eyed seeing is really needed in the engineering classrooms and schools. It's not talked about a lot in university, I find. Like, during my schooling at Dalhousie, a lot of the things I incorporated in papers were from my knowledge and bringing out that knowledge to my students. To my peers. And it was very hard explaining some stuff where you can't because you grew up with it. But more education is needed in the universities for two-eyed seeing, even if it's having a presentator come in and do a presentation on it, but most importantly, going out of the classroom and experience and looking at it, field trips, talk in circles. But tuaitsin is very an important concept in Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq territories, especially in Nova Scotia and in all Canada. But I think it's very important that it's brought to classes more than it is, I guess. But yeah.
Julie, how have you seen Two-Eyed Seeing impact your consulting work, or how have you tied Two-Eyed Seeing into your work?
Well, I think Ryan mentioned it in his explanation. It was something that I sort of learned indirectly from Ryan and I didn't know that that's what I was doing, but it was important to me to, involve the community in any solution for any project, not just water related, any project, and understanding the why of why we are doing this. What's the end goal? What are we trying to fix if there is something to fix? And I think it's, from a non-Indigenous person, it's not really my place to say exactly what needs. I think, Tiani, you mentioned some good things to include, but I think, the basic principle is to maintain open and to, include engagement into your projects, and to understand that, there's not just one way of doing things, and there's not just one reason to do things. There's potentially many reasons, and understanding those synergies is what will create the best solution for, a First Nation community. And my experience is not only to water, that does apply to really any infrastructure projects or any planning projects in First Nation communities.
And Carl, your experience with Two-Eyed Seeing, now that you're at the AFNWA, how have you seen that impact the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, well, certainly for myself, it's been, an immersion experience, and not obviously coming from that background. It's been certainly an eye opener, to say the least. But one thing that we've done at the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority is to try to incorporate it in the day-to-day, to the point that we established an Elders Advisory Lodge at our governance level to continue to be our conscience and to guide us, to ensure that we never lose sight of the importance. And really, it's really about making that connection with creation. First Nations communities do that extremely well. They do not see themselves separate from anything that happens in creation. And that is, it's challenging for a lot of us who've been brought up to use creation almost as a commodity to exploit. Whereas a First Nations community look at creation as an entity to engage with and to actually live through and live with. So it's just a totally, diametrically opposite approach to what many of us have been taught. So it is humbling to see it in action, and to speak to the elders about it. You can certainly understand their spiritual connection, in particular to water. They do not view water as a commodity. Let me tell you, not even close. It is life itself. I've had that drilled into me, and I accept that it is object and subject and a living entity. And if we take that approach, then we will certainly do much better for Mother Earth.
Yeah, I think Two-Eyed Seeing is something that we should always be considering with our engineering design. One final question. So many, like the term capacity building is often cited as a crucial component of building sustainable drinking and wastewater solutions for communities. So what does capacity building mean for each of you in an Indigenous or First Nations context? And maybe, or specifically in an engineering context or from a student context, from whatever perspective that you would like to go from. So maybe, Julie, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's all good. I think we touched upon a little bit of, what capacity building means and the importance of it. I spoke about it, in understanding the staff resources. There's a lack of capacity in terms of staff, and that could be tied to funding, related, or it could be tied to just the lack of individuals. I think from my perspective, the biggest thing that we could do to help capacity building will be to sorry, will be to, remove some of the red tape associated with the funding. And I think the biggest thing that I've helped communities with too is understanding their potential for what funding they can access. And although it's supposed to be accessible and supposed to be easy, there are a lot of things that, a First Nation community will need to do to get funding. And I think removing some of that and creating, a clearer runway to that is a huge way to help from an engineering perspective or from a consulting perspective at least.
Yeah. Tierney, can I go to you next?
Julie hit it spot on with everything, what I had written down. So, but yeah, capacity building in a First Nation context to me is providing more water for Indigenous communities, because like right now, growing up in Eskasoni, there's a lot of issues with that because we run out of water a lot in the summer, and it's really sad, and we'll have to shut water off for like a day or two to transfer some over to the other side of the community. So it's really providing more water when it's needed. And I forget the term in English, but it's nedugulim. It's like sustainability for resources. So we got to sustain our water too also, because we like to fill up pools in Eskasoni, I would say. But we have a lot of issues with that. But capacity building is having more resourceable water and more bigger plants that are much needed in First Nations communities.
Ryan, could I throw that to you next?
Sure.
Thank you.
The capacity building, in my opinion, is it's most traditional engineering perspective is it's a one-way process, and it's really not. It needs to be two ways, and that comes back to the idea of two-eyed seeing. But the reality is that if you don't go into these conversations around engineering, design, process, and that's again, whether it's water, wastewater infrastructure, right through to economic development and planning. The reality is if you're not going into it with an open heart and an open mind, you're doing the client a disservice, because really it's those conversations, it's that planning phase, it's that gained understanding that we get from those questions, the leading questions that ultimately should drive the solution. So, that's one element of how I perceive capacity building. But the other thing here being that, years of management approach that was taken by our federal government with respect to First Nation communities has resulted in an overall lack of capacity in a number of very specific areas. Now, don't get me wrong, our communities are well advanced in a number of areas, health, other types of area, education. But one of the ways that we typically haven't had as much advancement is in those engineering, and that is, I think, consistent with most of the STEM-based academic materials. The reality is that more often than not, our communities or our community members don't see a career on the backside of that. Most of our communities, there is very specific employment that's usually there. It's usually tied to economic development or band administration or health or child services and education. But what's happened is it's created a gap in many of those technical areas that many of these individuals would benefit from, and it's a little sad because you've got folks like AFNWA or SOAR. We want to hire those individuals and we want to provide them a light at the end of the tunnel. But until we get out there and help educate that there are other opportunities, this gap or barrier will continue to exist. So I think capacity building at all levels, from the universities right through to industry and as well as tribal organizations, we all play a role to help support a gained understanding of the opportunities that can be present on the backside.
Yeah, making opportunities accessible to those who could really benefit. is absolutely something that we should focus on. Carl, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of good things have been said already, but certainly from my perspective, is being very intentional to look for opportunities that will contribute to the triple bottom line. So you're really looking for that holistic approach from engineering. You're looking for social benefits, economic benefits, and environmental benefits. And we can certainly see that, by engaging with, all aspects of First Nations communities, from working with the bands, working with the contractors in town, working with the operators. And I apologize for my Jack Russell Terrier. She just went off on me, so that's not too bad that she's held her voice till now. So really, it's been being very intentional to really find the opportunity in the First Nations community, and certainly to look really for the youth to get involved. I mean, the youth are active, and they can spread the word throughout a community like you wouldn't believe. So if you get that youth involved at an early stage, you'll set the seeds basically for that capacity building.
I think at this point we're going to go to our Q&A from the audience. So if you're joining us from Facebook or YouTube, if you leave a comment, I should be able to see it, or someone will feed it to me. Just to get us started, though, I kind of wanted to touch on, well, it's a cue from me, I suppose, another one. But more specifically to you, Ryan, we're talking about youth. So obviously leadership, and a lot of youth nowadays really want to get involved in their communities and have strong leadership potential, and don't necessarily know how to access these opportunities or where to go. Do you have any advice for like a young person looking to get into engineering, starting their career, trying to get into water issues in their communities, kind of from that perspective? Like, what would your advice be to like a younger you, per se?
Yeah, I think it's overall just a lack of knowledge in the space, and to be honest, a lot of the systems guidance that's provided to our youth is fairly somewhat consistently applied across many of the regions of Canada. So you have employment training officers, you have education directors, you have youth guidance, and all these systems that I think we need to have greater outreach to those individuals, because they're the ones that are actually advising the youth. They're the gateway. And I think if we attempt to do more opportunities for outreach into the community schools, but we got to start much earlier than trying to catch kids at high school, right? My thoughts are, if we start modifying schools, that's a process that we're working on right now. I want to put in engineered approaches into that school so that the kid sees a turbine on the top of the school and is like, what's that? Or a solar panel, like things that will drive that inquisitive nature of youth. And hopefully we're not going to capture everyone, but you get more and more kids that are starting to ask these questions. And then meanwhile, if industry and academia are doing their job of that outreach, they'll start to see the lane. They'll start to have a better understanding of there is an opportunity for me, and it will actually have an opportunity to create impact. One of the things that I'm passionate about is economic development in the communities, because I think economic sovereignty is the key to advancement and progress across the board. To me, once you start to share those experiences and share, I helped find funding for this, which resulted in a new school. I helped find funding for this, which resulted in economic development, which created more employment. People will start to see, okay, there's opportunities for engineering. And instead of me necessarily helping my community through social programs or health, I can help my community in other ways and really drive an impact that's beyond just a singular level. It is at a community scale, or perhaps even regional scale if it's a nation-driven project. Yeah,
it's hard to be something you don't see reflected. Yeah, for sure. Starting them young is really important. So we have a few questions here from, I'm assuming, Facebook and YouTube. So we have one here from Sandra. She says, thank you so much for talking about two-eyed seeing in engineering. I teach in the capstone program at Dal Engineering and hope to learn more about incorporating this into my course. Thank you for the ideas, Tiani, and the comments from Ryan, Julie, and Carl. So important that we bring this into our profession. I think this is incredible conversation about two-eyed seeing, and I hope that we do get the chance to incorporate it more into our teachings at Dal. And I think if enough people are talking about it, then we have no choice but to listen, right? What are some of the regulations? This is from Will. Will? What are some of the regulations specific to First Nation communities that make for unique challenges slash solutions in water infrastructure? Julie, maybe this is a good one for you.
Well, I think what Tiani was saying too, and Tiani, maybe the better one to answer this first, is there's no regulations, right? Like, and I think that is what the challenge is. And Tiani, you might have been involved because you're just recently graduated from Dal, and I understand you spent some time in the lab, and I know that Dalhousie is working on creating those benchmarks for First Nation communities and understanding what those regulations could be from a First Nation standpoint that may be in line or above and beyond what the Canadian Drinking Water Guidelines are. And other challenges I'll speak to are lack of funding that hasn't been administered. But I guess I'll lob it over to Tiani now to build on that, because I think you probably have a good answer for this.
So there is no regulations, and there's only guidance to follow, I would say, and it's no specific targets that we have to meet. But we're looking at Nova Scotia right now to follow Nova Scotia regulations for Atlantic First Nation Water Authority. But I'm going to shoot it to Carl, because I think Carl is the best for this one.
Well, thanks, Tiani, and sort of that is a good segue to mention, what we're trying to accomplish, because of course we're a regional authority, so we operate right now in 3 provinces, right throughout the Wabanaki territory. So as a result, it's hard for us to say, we can't adopt the 3 different standards in those 3 different areas that currently exist. So we did look at best practice, not only in Atlantic Canada, but across the country. And in the end, we are going to base most of our framework on the Nova Scotia environment regulations, so that we can be consistent. So if an operator is working in Wolastoqey or working in Mi'kmaq territory, they're seeing the same thing. The documents are the same. The procedures are the same. So that is going to be, the additional challenge for us. But besides, not only are there no regulations, there's no regulator. And for those of us who are in the industry, we're so used to having that regulator, keeping our feet to the fire to make sure we're doing our jobs, and that also is missing. So in the interim, we're going to have to work through that until someday we hope there will be a First Nations regulator. We think there's an opportunity coming soon. So for those who are paying attention, there's going to be a repeal of the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act this year. And hopefully with that now a new act that everyone can live with in terms of from First Nations communities. And once the act is finally accepted and put to bed, the next logical step is regulations. But I should point out, this has not been an easy journey to try to get regulations. And like the first big study I saw was in 2006 with an expert panel that was chaired by Harry Swain, who identified the key elements of a regulatory framework. And surprisingly enough, here we are in 2022, we still don't actually have it. So as a going concern utility, we had no choice but to develop our own regulations. So hopefully, maybe if we do a good job, it may serve as a bit of a starting point for the nation. So let's hope that what we do together with Tiani and others at the utility to put this in motion will hopefully be a model for others to follow. So that is our hopes and aspirations at Atlantic First Nations Water Authority.
One last thing I'll just add that does create quite a bit of turmoil for us that are working in the consulting space on this is, there is a lack of regulatory authority, but in absence of that, what ends up happening is sometimes you get a lot of people that just want to stick their nose in anyway. So you'll be in a situation where the province is trying to employ regulation or guidance in an area that is absolutely not their business to do so. And, it's all a matter of whether or not, in this case, the funding agency wants to play nice with those regulatory agencies. It does create a lot of turmoil because you might end up in a process where you're trying to meet two different guidance and it's not consistent, and the rules that are applied are also not consistent. Further to that, like that actually, once you get into construction mode and you're actually in a space where you need to provide or seek out inspections or some of these other things, you just run into this nebulous, non-regulatory space where, people will try to say, well, I have authority here, and it's, well, no, you don't. And to that end, similarly, sometimes we want those inspections and you ask someone to come do it and they'll refuse to do it. So if there was much more clear definition in the regulation and guidance, I think it would address a lot of these concerns that become problematic for both the communities as well as the professionals working on these projects.
Yep, we obviously need a space that is regulated and managed properly by our governing bodies. This is from Megan. You guys all probably know Megan. This is to Ryan specifically. Do you see a role for Indigenous water professionals / design engineers in contributing to the revision of the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act?
I don't see how the role wouldn't be there. In fact, the guidance should be driven by Indigenous professionals, or at least those highly knowledgeable of the space, because as I kind of mentioned earlier in the question period, was a lot of the issues and concerns and limitations can only be gained from perspective of actually working with the community. So in absence of that, even if you're a regulator and you have lots of experience working with municipalities or what have you, it really is not necessarily directly translatable to an Indigenous perspective. So I think it's critical. And if there isn't a role for Indigenous professionals in this space, then it's being done completely wrong.
Yep, I think that is an excellent segue to this question. How do you feel the situation will look 5 to 10 years from now? So are we going to see more Indigenous engineers in the space? Hopefully. Who would like to answer? Is anyone looking to answer this one?
Perhaps I'll take a stab at it.
Okay.
We sure hope it's going to improve. We've made a lot of progress, certainly I'd say in the last 2 to 3 years. And, we're on the cusp of really, launching this Atlantic First Nations Water Authority this year. So certainly in Atlantic Canada, we expect things to be, looking very different in 5 to 10 years. And we've got to give ourselves a 10-year time frame, actually, to really make sure that we've got things, in a good position. We can say things are in a state of good repair from infrastructure, and we meet the highest standards in the land. So we feel that any First Nations community should receive water and wastewater services that the rest of the country takes for granted, quite simply. So there's no reason that in 10 years' time we can't be at that place. But we can never lose track of investment to keep it there as well. So we got to make sure we establish the sustainable funding and certainly the approaches that will keep it going. So it's running a sound operation is like doing the laundry. It's never done. So we have to continue to improve. So although we hope to meet some benchmark standards within 5 to 10 years, we got to always be diligent to keep it there, and that will require that sustainable approach for generations.
Does anyone else have any comments about the future of water?
I guess I will add, I recently did a deep dive in how much investment has gone in for water and wastewater in First Nation communities in Canada, and how that trend related to the long-term drinking water advisories, and there is a trend. So over the past 5 years, the increased investment in not only capital funding but operations and maintenance funding that has been increased have resulted in lower drinking water advisories. It's not to the tune that it probably should be. It's been a slower investment, but I do think that we are moving in an overall better direction, and especially with some of the things Ryan mentioned, with increasing exposure to that to young engineers, Indigenous engineers. I think it will get better and better.
One thing I'll add on this too
Yep.
is, I've been working in this space for quite some time. The last 2 to 3 years, like Carl said, there's been a lot of progress. That's a result of a number of things. But one thing that I think also needs to be highlighted is the political climate and movement across Canada. It's palpable. It's very different. And the amount of allyship that Indigenous persons, Indigenous perspectives is gaining in the non-Indigenous world of Canada, it's so different than it was 5 years ago. And it's funny, when I started my career, I got a comment from a colleague, and it's a friend of mine, and he said to me probably 6 years ago, he said, Ryan, he's like, you're really adopting this Indigenous lens. He says, it seems different than what I know of you. And he's like, I'm just asking the reason, is there a reason for that? And I said to him, well, in this case, when I started my career 17 years ago, would it have been helpful for me to identify as Indigenous? And I can answer that question. It would not. It would have been a very large barrier, and it would have had major implications on my long-term career. So, whereas now it's not as scary to admit these things, and it's actually an opportunity. So, as evidenced by the fact that my company just essentially gave me funding to build a competitor, that's a pretty bold statement.
Incredible, yeah. So that concludes the end of our Q&A, and I just wanted to thank all you guys for such insightful conversation. I think this is a really important conversation to have and to keep talking about. So I'm going to throw it back to John, and he's going to give us some closing remarks.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you for moderating today's event. You did an excellent job on an important topic. Thank you to Tiani and Ryan and Julie and Carl. Thank you for the time you spent with us, but more importantly, sharing your insights. I think we've had a very engaging and powerful conversation, and you've kind of hit on that. When the time we've allotted, the conversation expands beyond that, and we could probably go for much longer today, but it is the time we have. Thank you to our audience for attending, for the comments you put up and the questions. They're much appreciated. We did record this event on YouTube, so it will be available in the future, so you can review it or share it with colleagues. So look to the engineering website for a link for that. So we'll conclude here now. This is an annual event, so we look forward to hosting you again next year on another topic that intersects between the impact engineers have on communities and the engineers themselves who participate in that impact. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.